This session is titled Ethical Issues Experienced by Criminal Justice Practitioners, Implications for Training and Education. At this time, I'll turn things over to the presenter.
Hi, I'm Dr. Koehle. I'm a senior contributing faculty member for Walden School of Criminal Justice. Go ahead, next slide, please. So I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I worked in the field, at various parts of the field. I started my career working in the mental health field for about a year, spent a year in corrections, and then about 12 years in policing, where I had a variety of positions and assignments. During that time, during my policing career, I started teaching part-time and then eventually took a full-time position at a state university here in Pennsylvania. Most recently, I returned to the field as a district judge here in Pennsylvania, a position that I just started here in January. So, and I've been with Walden since 2014, teaching both the bachelor's, master's, and supervising some dissertations as well. So my education, bachelor's in administration of justice, master's criminal justice, and PhD in criminology. Next slide, please. So, like I said, I started teaching, about 17 years ago, and I, as a new teacher, I think I was in my late 20s there. I really kind of struggled a little bit delivering curriculum. I think sometimes there's an assumption that just because you've spent a lot of time in school, you're going to be a good teacher. Fortunately, my wife is a teacher, and she taught me how to actually create lesson plans. During my early, experiences teaching, and I was tasked with teaching an ethics class, criminal justice ethics. And I'll tell you two things about that. First, when I went to the police academy, I was, you look over a police academy curriculum and you see the different blocks of time that things are allocated. And I saw we had I think it was a 12 or 15 hour block on ethics. And as a younger professional or adult, I was 22 or 23 years old then, I kind of was taken aback by that. I thought, do they really need to teach us ethics here? I mean, we should have that by now. And then a couple years later, when I started teaching, and I was looking at some of the textbooks to use, I was a little bit disappointed in what they were covering, just because I didn't feel like they were covering issues that were important. So, and then one other thing occurred, or I noticed, when I was delivering curriculum, whether it was in the ethics class or I taught an American policing class at the time, I noticed that students would become very interested when I would use stories from the field or what might be referred to as a narrative. But I didn't want my class to become, just get up there and tell a bunch of war stories and entertain the students. So I started to do some research on the use of storytelling and narratives as a pedagogical tool. And it turns out that there's a whole body of literature on it. It's great. It was very helpful to me. I'm not going to take a real deep dive into that, but I do want to talk about it briefly here. Briefly, using stories is more effective because when we use stories, more parts of the brain are actively engaged. And if you think about it, just in your daily life, like if I go home from work today and my wife says, "How was your day?" and I say, "Well, it wasn't so good," there's probably going to be a story with that to provide the context. So similar to teaching, if we're talking about whether it's a criminal justice ethics topic or some other criminal justice concept, if I can take some sort of story or narrative from the field and apply it there, it's going to make it more real. Another thing that I noticed teaching early on was that A lot of other applied disciplines have pretty extensive field rotations. So if you look at the medical field, or if you look at education as an example, and I use those because I have family members that do that, they have pretty extensive rotations as part of their degree. Criminal justice normally does not. I mean, there might be some bachelor's degree programs out there that require internships, but even the ones that do offer internships, a lot of the internships are they're not as active as what the teachers and nurses are experiencing, because they're really getting hands-on experience. So I kind of was taking all this information that I was thinking about and trying to make my classes better. And I wanted to come up with a better way to teach ethics. And I also, just to make the point here, criminal justice professionals, they are and should be held to a higher standard. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And, quite simply, there's a lot at stake here. So the importance of criminal justice ethics cannot be understated. Next slide, please. So a few years back, I proposed a research study where I would go out and interview current and former criminal justice professionals. I wanted to get a representative sample from the criminal justice system. So I wanted to get, some folks from law enforcement, the judicial system, corrections, and I wanted to do one-on-one interviews, and I wanted to talk to them about ethical dilemmas that they either faced or they were aware that other the other contexts that they had faced, with the intent of using their stories to create basically cases could work through, reflect on, and build the skills that are necessary in order to operate ethically in the field. Next slide, please. So as a result of the interviews, and it took me, I took a summer, not the whole summer, but I spent the summer, doing this research. So with the 8 criminal justice professionals, I had about 16 hours of recording. I naively thought that I would be able to transcribe that myself. For any of you doctoral students out there, anybody looking to do research, unless you're a really good typer, you'll have to pay for transcription services. Don't think you can do it on your own. But there were 4 emergent themes that came out of these interviews. The first one was a negative influence of the occupational subculture. So there's a fair amount of literature research on the police occupational subculture being negative, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. Concern for retaliation, which is very real and concerning. Stigma associated with reporting misconduct of fellow employees, and then noble cause. Next slide, please. So, like I said, there's a fair amount of research and literature on this, but there's definitely a criminal justice or police subculture. And I would argue that this extends to other criminal justice agencies, not all, and it's not an either or. I mean, I think there's certain agencies that this is more prevalent with, but these subcultures are, the characteristics include secrecy, solidarity, and skepticism, cynicism, and then an us versus them mentality. So you can very clearly see how these type of attributes would be detrimental to a high degree of ethics and moral standards. Next slide, please. Concern for retaliation. So some of the research participants that I spoke to described, whether they reported or were involved in trying to bring to light some sort of unethical behavior. There was concern that they might be punished in an indirect way, by getting undesirable assignments, potentially, if it involved a supervisor or someone that was maybe associated with the supervisor, they might get a poor performance evaluation. They might get passed over for promotion. And probably the most serious report was that, and this was from a police officer, is that there was real concern that, if you were involved in reporting misconduct, then you might find yourself in a situation where you have a delay on or no backup in an emergency situation, which is really quite serious. Next slide, please. So another issue here is, or another theme that came up, was the stigma associated with telling. Snitching certainly has a negative connotation. Coworkers, the concern that coworkers might not trust or alienate a person. And this is very unfortunate because, we live in a time now, I think, where it's really important, if you see something, say something, no matter what it is. This is really an important way to operate. And as a former police officer, I mean, just from a crime standpoint, we rely on the community, or we need to rely on the community to tell us about things. And this sort of, if you see something, say something, becomes important in the workplace too, if there are ethical issues. If we look at some of the high profile police misconduct cases just in the past few years, one of the consistent themes with the officers involved is that there was a history of misconduct. So, that there was, definitely an awareness of these individuals, either behaving unethically or worse. And, as the saying goes, a few bad apples can ruin the cart. I don't know if that's necessarily true here, but a few bad apples can certainly, cause a lot of issues for an otherwise professional and ethical agency. They can, create a lot of distrust from the community when it might just be, one or a few officers that are involved. And this is very problematic. I think we've seen enough things on the news to tell us that. Next slide, please. Noble cause is another theme, the last theme that I'll talk about here. And again, there's some support in the literature for this as well. It's that, the unethical behavior is justified to achieve, ironically, some sort of justice. So it's the means justifying the end, or, we might be looking at somewhat evening the playing field, so to speak. This gets a little bit tricky because, there are situations in law enforcement where, police officers are allowed to use deception. Those areas should be clearly defined to the officer if they're in a situation where they're going to be using deception, if they're in an undercover role, or if they're, employing some sort of investigative techniques or strategies that involve deception, then they should know what the boundaries of that are. So the noble cause, the rationalizing of unethical or even illegal behavior is, completely unacceptable. But again, this was a theme that arose as a result of, from the research. Next slide, please. So some of the implications for education and training, and before I even get into those, I think there's a couple important things to think about here. First of all, The actual agencies themselves, the actual criminal justice agency, they need to have a very clear mission statement that's not just words on paper, but it's something that defines who they are and how they behave. And so it's up to the leadership and the individual officers to not have a culture or an environment that allows for any of the themes that I mentioned today, or permits anything else that would contribute to unethical behavior. So kind of building that environment that is ethical, it's accountable, it's transparent. I think the other thing that I learned from the research is that folks that are college level or beyond, maybe even younger than that, they understand right and wrong, but they're going to be put in situations that they're just not familiar with. So I think that's where some of these implications for education and training come through. We want to first have a system to identify unethical behavior, and again, with the noble cause or some of the other things, like you might get into these situations where it's like someone says, well, I'm going to let that slide, or it's okay to do this, or it's okay to do that. Because sometimes like just talking about what would maybe be considered minor unethical behavior, like accepting gratuities, right? Is it okay for a police officer to get a free cup of coffee or something like that? And my response to that has always been, is it really worth the potential, for problems later on? Like it's a cup of coffee, you just have a blanket policy about things like that. And I think because criminal justice professionals are held to a high standard, they need to really consider ethics and how it's trained, and or the training that they receive as a serious component of their initial and ongoing curriculum and training. So as it relates to the actual training, I think scenario-based and role-playing training would be very beneficial, especially for folks that are inexperienced, but also just as a refresher. Agencies routinely get sued for failure to train. And this is sometimes more in operational areas, whether it's pursuits or things like that, use of force. But I think that if agencies don't make this a centerpiece of their at least annual curriculum and training, then they have problems in those areas. How can they correct them? So just to close here, as we move forward here in the professionals, I think it's really important that we focus on training folks in a way that's meaningful and is going to work in the field. This, of course, involves doing research on best practices, and we're preparing people to do some of the most important jobs out there. They're literally dealing with people's lives, and you want to give them the best training and put them in the best position for success themselves. I would venture to say that some of the officers that were involved in some ethical behavior over the years and have been caught, I'm hopeful that they regret it, and I wonder if they received proper training or better training in these areas, if there would have been different outcomes. So that is the end of my presentation. I've left some time here for some questions or comments if anybody has them.
Wonderful. Yes, this has been excellent information, and there are some questions coming in the chat, so feel free to type your comments or questions there. The first question is, what do you suggest the next step be regarding covering the knowledge gap within ethics?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that certainly more research, continuing research on not only what the consistent themes, what the consistent issues are, in the field, and then kind of as I think I'm kind of scratching the surface here a little bit. Coming up with ways to teach it. So whether that's through the use of case studies, and sometimes with the role playing, I can speak from personal experience that sometimes in trainings where they want you to role play, it seems kind of silly at first, but I have to say that a lot of those trainings are very effective. One such training that I was involved in not too long ago was crisis intervention training, where there's a lot of role playing, and I can't directly correlate it, but there's a high degree of success for CIT, and I would make a pretty strong argument, I think, just from my perspective, that a lot of that is due to the role playing that's involved. You're not just sitting in a classroom getting hit with information; you're actually applying it. And the other, I think, unique thing about this field in particular is that we have a lot of younger, inexperienced people in the entry-level positions. So you have somebody that maybe they go to college for their bachelor's or an associate's degree, and they go to a police academy or other type of training, and they're in the field. They're 22, 23 years old, and they're a police officer, a corrections officer, a probation officer. So these are entry-level positions. The ironic thing about these positions is that they not so much have as much low visibility, but they do have a lot of low visibility discretion, meaning that these individuals are out there working in the field, making decisions, using discretion, and they're making very important decisions. It's the patrol officers that are responding to things in progress. It's the probation or corrections officers that are supervising offenders. So they're having, the most contact with the public, and they tend to be the most, the newest, the most inexperienced people, though. So it's not like they kind of graduate up to that. They're, right in the mix right away. So I think that that is a serious consideration. I think it's ironic, but it's just the way that the field is, and you do learn a lot. But there's a potential too for problems if you have your least experienced people at sometimes doing the most important or serious work.
And there's another question in the chat. What is the biggest subtopic in ethics that you think could benefit the most from advancing research?
Well, that's a really good question. What I'd like to do as a follow-up study to this is sort of take the qualitative information that I have and probably answer that question that you asked. So maybe develop a survey that I could send out to, hundreds of current and former criminal justice practitioners, and get some ideas from them about, what's particularly important, not just which subtopic is most important, but and how is it important, and how can we teach that? The other thing is that, again, back to the mission statement and back to the constitutional oath, I think these are very important reminders to agency staff. Like, this is very serious. I would make an argument for having officers on an annual basis reaffirm that oath. I just think it's really important. Here in my office as a judge, I have the 4 canons that they set forth. I have them posted here. I look at them on a pretty regular basis, and it's just a good reminder for me. So it's something that I look at and think about.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have time for one more question from
Okay.
Joseph asks, what are your thoughts relative to departments that have to rehire officers who were involved in unethical incidents because an arbitrator has overturned a department's decision? And what impact does that have on learning for the new office, relating to topics for those new officers?
That's a great question. And I think that probably a lot of folks, and Dr. McMillan and I know each other, and I know Dr. McMillan has a lot of experience in the field. First, I'd say that I think it's unfortunate in some of these instances that agencies are forced to rehire individuals like this. I think it then makes it challenging to teach, ethics, and if you're kind of using the well, you could potentially get fired for doing this, and then in your agency they've actually rehired somebody that likely should have stayed fired. That does make it hard to teach. I think the big thing too is just the and it's something that I learned working in a crime prevention and community relations role when I was a police officer. Being accountable and transparent, I think, makes your job so much easier. That's just and I really learned that when I was working with the public a lot. Just sitting down with people and saying, look, this is how it is. This is everything that we have. These are the tools and strategies that we can use. Instead of, kind of keeping the community at arm's length. And I think as it relates to ethics and just really some of the positions that some police departments and maybe other criminal justice agencies are in. And I think the police are especially important here because they have more direct interaction with the public. It's just, we've got to work together. It's like, Sir Robert Peel said, the police are the public and the public are the police. It's true. It should be true in that there's a real relationship there. And there's just no room for the unethical behavior because that type of behavior, it undermines the public trust, and it undermines a lot of the good work that other officers do. So I think that maybe as it results to unethical behavior by particular officers, maybe there needs to be stronger policies to remove unethical officers and in cases where an arbitrator couldn't force them to rehire them back.
All right, well, thank you so much. I want to thank you once again for sharing your expertise and your experience with us. You gave us some great insights to consider as we continue researching this topic and takeaways for the event today that we can apply to our practice.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions and the opportunity to present. Have a great day. Thank you.
You're welcome.